Hey guys, welcome to a roundup video for the snares. So I just want to start this off saying that there are so many different types of snares in the EDM world, so many different types of genres that the tips and tricks I presented you with in the mixing section, they're definitely something that you can use on pretty much any snare. However, you do still want to be conscious of, make sure that you don't just do those things just because you have them at your disposal. Make sure that there's something that strengthens the snare in the context of your song. That's the most important element. So I was just arming you with that knowledge, and then it's up to you as a producer or a DJ to make that decision in the mix and actually choose, do I need to do this? Does the snare need this, etc. That being said, the process that I like to do when I'm looking at snares is first, find a great sounding sample or buy good sounding samples. When you start with a good sample, everything becomes so much easier. All right, now step 2 is going to be to decide what type of snare are you going for in this song or this genre, or are you trying to blend genres, or what are you trying to do? Is the snare going to be an accent to the kick, or do you really want it to stand out? Because you need to have that decision made kind of while you're finding your good sample. And then the mix becomes easier because of that decision. A lot of mixing is actually just decision making. So if you can learn to trust your ear when you're actually dragging in samples, the rest of the process becomes really easy. So then what you can do, so step 3 would be to make sure you're separating elements of the mix that will be in the center position. Make sure that you turn some of those into mono tracks just to free up a little bit of the stereo width. What I mean by that is turn your kick into a mono track. See if your bass works as a mono track. In certain genres it will. It might not in dubstep or a really bass-heavy genre, but in other genres like progressive or tropical house, they can work as a monophonic track really well. And then what you're doing is you're just cleaning up some of the stereo space for your snare to live in, because your snare should be centered. All right, but you have a lot of elements in the center of your mix: your kick, your bass, your lead, your vocals, sometimes your claps or your snare. So there's a lot of, space that can be fighting for attention. The fourth thing you can do is open up an EQ on your track. And this is actually the first real mixing thing that you're doing to the snare. Everything else was more prep work. What you're going to want to do is make sure there's not too many low frequencies in your snare. You might want to end up boosting some of the highs to let it stand out above the kick and above the other synths and things like that. But that's totally a stylistic choice, up to you. But typically, a typical snare might look like this, where I am boosting, I'm cutting some of the lows, I'm boosting some of the highs here, and I'm turning down like 1,000 to maybe even 5K, because that's where, if there's a vocal, that's a lot of times where the vocal lives. So that separates a little bit of the snare from the vocal and lets them stand out on their own. So you're not EQing the snare to make it sound good. If you have to EQ a snare to make it sound good, go back to step 1, find a better sample. The EQ should be used as a way to separate it from other elements within the mix. All right, now the fourth thing that you can do is, it's kind of the processing step, where you're going to add some effects that make it, it's like the cherry on top, right? You can compress a snare. You typically don't want to compress it a whole lot. I typically would prefer to use an enveloper or an enveloper, just because I can control things like, okay, maybe the snare sample, I really like the sound of it, but maybe there's too much body. I can turn down the release a little bit. I can turn up the gain of the attack stages if it's not snappy enough. So I love using this plugin on snares. I think it's really helpful and actually better than compression. If you need a thicker snare sound, you can mess around with parallel compression. By no means is it something that I find myself doing a lot, because if you start from a good sample, it's something that kind of just falls into place. And then lastly, spatial processing, right? Reverb, potentially delay, things that will either draw it into the back of the mix or kind of push it forward, or just add some 3-dimensional depth. That's what reverb and delays can help do. I like using reverb, and I like putting a gated or a kind of a syncopated pre-delay reverb on some of my snares, just to thicken up the space in between the snare hit and the kick and the next snare hit, etc. So there is a roundup of some different things that you can do to make your snares stand out in your mix.